Hello and welcome to the final presentation, which is social work and human rights for refugees and asylum seekers. What are we hoping to achieve by this one? Well, we hope that we're going to develop an appreciation of the complexities of the of refugees and asylum seekers and their human rights and the policies that try to address them. Then we'll also be able to articulate the human rights issues involved in dealing with refugees and asylum seekers, and we'll be able to articulate the role that social workers can play in addressing the human rights of refugees and asylum seekers. It's always a good idea to think and reflect on what it is like to be a refugee. If you had to leave home very suddenly, what would you take? And what would you leave behind? And who would you take with you? And who would you leave? When would you leave? At what point do you decide, no, I can't stand here anymore, I have to go? What is that point that will make you make that decision? Think about that as you go through the rest of this lecture. Now, becoming a refugee. A refugee is a person seeking refugee status because their lives are in danger. There are people who are seeking refuge. Two different things. People can be in different stages of displacement. The first stage is being in potential danger and contemplating whether to leave or to stay. The other stage is being displaced within your own country. The technical term is IDP, that is internally displaced person or persons. The other phase could be living under military or foreign occupation, or living in a war situation. The other phase is when you have crossed the border and now you become an asylum seeker because you are seeking refuge and you are trying to be accepted as a refugee. The other phase is where your asylum is acknowledged and you legally become a refugee. Some people can go to the other phase of being resettled in a third country, but that only happens to a small fraction of the people who are affected by this process of displacement. Borrowing from the Holy Book, the Bible, for the Christians, the concept of Exodus is people on the move. The Bible talks of people who are fleeing persecution from Egypt and going to the promised land. So it's a similar scenario that we have. People are on the move all over the world, moving from Africa to Europe, to Asia and other places, people moving from the Middle East. And we have had movement in the past also from Europe to Australia, America and Asia. So people have always been on the move historically for a number of reasons or pressures, such as war, whether they are escaping war, or like the Greeks under Alexander the Great, who are moving to wage war, or the Romans and other powers of the past. They would move to conquer and occupy other areas. People have sometimes also moved because of natural disasters. You had the famine in Ireland with a big proportion of the people there moving to Australia, America, and other places because of the famine. Some have moved because of adventure. People who have moved from, say, UK to Australia to seek some kind of adventure. Other people have moved because of overpopulation. When people are overpopulated, some members of the population might move to other less populated areas. So that's the historical situation, and that is how, as a human race, we have been able to occupy virtually every nation in the world, starting from Africa to everywhere, to look at where the Eskimo or Canadian Indians live in permanently frozen areas, and they have made a home out of that. The Bedouins in the deserts and so forth. What's different these days is the national borders that make movement a much, much more complicated affair. At the moment, the total number of people on the move is unprecedented. We were saying last year that has not been seen since Second World War, but what's happening now goes even beyond the numbers that we had following the Second World War. The Office of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees is the one that is mandated to look into the issues of refugees. They are to protect them and support them. Three critical areas of supporting them is voluntary repatriation. That is when people agree to go back to their areas where things have settled down. They can be assisted to go back. Local integration, where they can be absorbed into the place where they have moved into, especially when the prospect of going back don't seem realistic. The other one that we are more familiar with is resettlement into a third country, like Australia. So the UNHCR, as it's popularly referred to, was formed in 1949 as a response to the huge refugee crisis following the World War II, and that was mainly in Europe. Since then, refugee problems have spread to other areas like Africa, Asia, and in reality, it's now a global issue. Now, what has international law got to say about this? From the international law, we get at the definition of what a refugee is. And the definition was initially narrow and restrictive and was based purely on the European situation of the 1940s following the Second World War. So in Article 1 of the 1951 Refugee Convention, which we refer to as the Convention, it defines a refugee as a person who is in fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. And because of that fear, is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself or herself to the protection of that country. So when you apply to be a refugee in a country like Australia, or even if you're in a third country and you want to be recognized as a refugee, this is the test that they put you through. You have to satisfy that definition. So they will see that you're not just fleeing because you are looking for better job opportunities, but it is actually out of fear. The 1967 Protocol of the Convention recognized that the problem was not just in Europe but everywhere, and because it was supposed to expire in 1951, this 1967 Protocol extended it beyond that particular date. So that's why it reads, considering that it is desirable that equal status should be enjoyed by all refugees covered by the definition in the Convention, irrespective of the deadline of January 1st, 1951. So who are asylum seekers? Asylum seekers, an asylum seeker is a person who has not yet been determined as a refugee, so they have not been put through that test of that definition. So up to that point, they are regarded as asylum seekers. And once they satisfy that test, then they can be accepted as refugees. Now, one thing that would be good for you to think about is that definition. Do you think there are some people who it leaves out, though they might need protection? For example, if you're in a country that is in a general war situation, but you don't have, you're not being targeted personally for your race or religion or whatever, would that convention cover you? Apart from the people who may or may not be covered, can you think why we are stuck with the definition? Why we, despite any shortcomings, we have not been able to look into it again? So in your opinion, do you think it is too narrow, or some people, especially some politicians in Australia and other countries, have claimed that it is too broad? So they feel that also many people are coming because this definition is too broad. They would like it to be tightened even more. So in the forum, I would be happy for you to discuss what you think about these particular issues. Now, considering the current situation and also recent past, we can see the sort of situations that have led to refugees. Now, the theater of conflict keeps shifting, so and that can also be reflected by the people coming to Australia. In the 70s, we had people from what is called Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and then that was because of the conflict that was there between 1940s and 70s, where there was that big war in the northern South Vietnam, with America intervening and Australia joining. Then there was also the conflict in Korea in the 40s. Then in the 1960s, around Africa, there were wars of independence, with a lot of people being displaced. Places like Mozambique, continuing in the 70s in places like Angola. So there were very many refugees in the countries around Africa, which were neighbors to the countries that were under conflict. Then in the 1970s into the 1980s, the superpower rivalry between the US and the then Soviet Union, remnant of which is Russia now, the rivalry around the world caused a lot of conflict between those people who wanted to have communist governments and those who wanted to have socialist governments, and they were handsomely supported by the respective powers, Soviet Union and the US, with weapons, moral support, like other form of material support. So these two countries waged wars between themselves, but they were proxy wars. They were wars that were fought within different countries and sometimes between countries. Very, very messy situation, what was referred to as the Cold War era. In the 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed, so America was left as the sole superpower. But those ideologically based conflicts were replaced by inter-ethnic conflicts. Wars now are fought on ethnic identities. For example, in the Balkans, in Rwanda, in Congo, places like Somalia and Ethiopia. Then in the 21st century that we are in, the war on terror following 11th of September 2001, bombing by Al-Qaeda. Then following that, America invaded Afghanistan, and later on they invaded Iraq, and thousands and thousands of refugees were produced by those conflicts. Then since 2012, we have had what is called the Arab Spring, where Arab countries that were under dictatorship decided to fight for democracy, the result of which has been most dramatic in Syria, where more than 4 million people have so far been displaced, majority of them going to Lebanon, but others flowing over to Turkey, Greece, and eventually to European countries, particularly Germany. As we speak, or as I speak, you have the Rohingya, I'm not sure how you pronounce this, in Myanmar, who are Muslim, who trace their history back to, I think, Sri Lanka, but they've been settled there for centuries. But now they're being displaced, creating humongous crisis. More than 500,000 people have been displaced from their homes, which have been burnt down, and the usual killings and rapes have been happening. Where do you think the next crisis is going to be? Could it be in the Korean Peninsula? We have Kim Jong-un throwing missiles over Japan, and America threatening to destroy the entire country. That could be the next crisis, but it is always hard to make these sort of predictions, and I'm not going to try. Now, the UNHCR statistics are quite sobering. If you can visit their site, you can see the latest figures. But as you know, not all people get registered. There are many asylum seekers who stay with their relatives or are just hosted by other people, or are internally displaced in their countries, but they are not necessarily registered. So the actual numbers are never known. But even the known ones are extremely high. You're talking of something like over 65 million people forcibly displaced around the world. 21.3 million are recognized as refugees. Some of these, the 5.2 million Palestinians under UN, they have been in that situation since 1948, long time. There are also people who are stateless. Up to about 10 million people in the world have no state that they can call their own. It's important to think the role of human rights here. It's the human rights violations that lead to refugee crisis. So really, the heart of the refugee crisis is human rights violations. For example, you can look at freedom of expression. People are prevented from expressing themselves, and if they express themselves, they get themselves in trouble. Torture and threat of torture is part of that persecution. Discrimination, like that case we have mentioned of Rohingya, they've been discriminated as a Muslim community in a predominantly Buddhist country. So discrimination can take all forms: racial, ethnicity, sexual orientation. Many gay people are persecuted because of that orientation, sexual orientation, gender, political opinion, or membership of a particular political party. If you happen to be in the wrong geographical place, that can be an issue. Sometimes people fight between people who are in the south and those who are in the north. Religion, particularly religious minorities, cultural differences, you can talk about class, age, disability, name it, and people have been discriminated for it. Rape and sexual assault are used as weapons of violence, particularly against women, and therefore gender-based violence is one of those issues that are of high concern to United Nations. Then the human rights violation that leads to refugees is the issue of insecurity, war, occupation, or terrorism. More recently, we have started to focus on issues of natural disasters, especially with climate change and some island homes of some people being seriously threatened. Another reason why sometimes people move is economic collapse. If you're living in a country that cannot support you, then people move. A lot of people moving from Africa these days to Europe. It's not because of political persecution, it's because of the economic collapse of their countries. Now, how has Australia been responding to this variety of problems around the world? Australia has always been an active participant within the UN, drafting the human rights treaties, and also supporting UN agencies like UNHCR, supporting them financially, and also taking some of the refugees that the UNHCR recommends that they need to be processed. So Australia has got two programs when it comes to processing refugees. We have what is referred to as onshore and offshore programs. Onshore is the one where people arrive here, say by boat. Sometimes they're put in detention, or they might be processed in the community. Others arrive by air as well. But the main focus here is the point of processing, so they are processed within Australia, that is onshore. Offshore is where Australia will go to places like Ethiopia or Burma or Myanmar or Pakistan and process the people who are there as refugees, who are recognized over there as refugees by the United Nations, and they look for the ones that might be resettled in Australia. So that's the offshore program. Now, who manages to come to Australia? In reality, many refugees cannot afford the expense of coming to Australia. So the ones that manage to come are a small fraction compared to other countries like Turkey or even Germany or Pakistan or Kenya. So the majority of refugees and asylum seekers are located in some of those third world countries, such as Pakistan and Kenya and other countries like Uganda, Ethiopia. But some European countries too, particularly recently, they have been receiving huge numbers. Think about Italy, Germany, Greece and Turkey. They have had massive numbers. The boat arrivals in Australia attract the headlines, but in reality they are very, very small numbers by world standards. Very, very, very small. That's because we don't have large borders with other countries. A lot of the concern, I guess, is for fear that if those ones who make it are processed and given refugee status, that it might make Australia attractive as a destination for the millions and millions out there that are seeking resettlement. The UNHCR aims to find durable solutions to the people who are facing the refugee crisis. So what does a durable solution mean? A durable solution is one that resolves the problem for the people who are affected so that they can start rebuilding their lives in dignity and in peace. One of the approaches that I think we have already mentioned is repatriation. So UNHCR will work with the country of origin as well as the host countries where the refugees are based and assist the refugees to return home. They might provide transport. They might even give them a little bit of money so that when they go back they can be able to either return to farming if they are farmers or set up some small business so they don't just come from one form of destitution to another. Another durable solution is local integration. What is meant by this is that the refugees are allowed to settle where they are. And that has happened, for example, with the refugees from Rwanda and Burundi. They have been allowed to settle in Tanzania, in Africa, and they are given full citizenship status and they become Tanzanians. The other form of durable solution is resettlement. This is for people who are not able to be reintegrated into the communities where they are. They can't return home. Then countries like Australia are requested to offer resettlement for refugees in that situation. So Australia, USA and Canada are some of the leading countries when it comes to resettlement. Those are solutions to the crisis, but if you want to have lasting solutions, then you have to go back even further and look at the root cause of the problems and how can we stop or prevent the refugees being produced in the first place. It would be interesting if you can take your time and consider the role of the following in mitigating or abating conflict and rights abuse. What role could be played by peace? I'm sure you think that's obvious, but it's good to consider why we don't have peace in many countries. Non-violent solutions to political and other differences. Again, looks logical, but not to everyone. Consider why and why not. Upholding human rights, respecting democratic processes and rule of law, adding inequalities between and within countries, not having colonization, not colonizing other countries, not invading and occupying weaker countries by the powerful ones, and also the final one, preventing human-induced climate change leading to natural disasters and displacement of people. So take your time and think, what role these particular items that I have listed can play in prevention of production of refugees, and why we are not using them. Social workers have an important role to play. As I have mentioned in my Master of Social Work thesis, I found from my studies that social workers are the leading profession when it comes to working with the refugees. Now, I have mentioned here that ASW is opposed to offshore processing. Offshore processing is not the same as the offshore program. Offshore processing here is referring to when refugees try to come to Australia, but instead they are taken to offshore places like Nauru and Manus Island. So ASW has said it's opposed to that. Can you think of some reasons why they would be taking that position? What role can social workers play to ensure that refugees and asylum seekers' human rights and dignity are upheld? Social workers can also play a role in UNHCR and other international bodies that support refugees. You can make monetary contribution, or you can work for those organizations, or you can volunteer with those organizations and go and work in refugee camps and places like that. Social workers can also have a role to play in promoting world peace, mitigating climate change, upholding human rights, and promoting participatory democracy. And I should hasten to add that many social workers are already doing that around the world. The refugee issue in Australia is a very emotive one that sometimes you have to be careful when you discuss with your family members, because people take different positions, and particularly when it comes to the issue of boat people, they are seen as a threat to Australia's way of life, and derogatory sort of terms are used to refer to them. Issues like illegal queue jumpers. Some even try to talk to them about them as potential terrorists, potential source of diseases like AIDS and so on. And other people see them as a threat to their jobs and even to Australian way of life. So have a think about these issues. See what are facts and what are myths, and how can we deal with those facts and myths. Would be good to also notice in your local area who is responding to the refugees. In Wagga, where our campus is based, we have the Multicultural Council of Wagga is the organization that has been involved in resettlement of refugees locally. That's going to be the case until October this year, when that responsibility is passed on to the Red Cross, Australia Red Cross, who are the one who has recently won the tender to continue with that work. There are other services that have been involved, such as Centre Care, Catholic services, Red Cross. Even before they have taken over the that resettlement program, they have been involved in working with asylum seekers. St. Vincent de Paul was a partner with Multicultural Council in refugee resettlement. So think about your area. Who is looking after the refugees and asylum seekers over there? This is not necessarily a current issue, but when Obama was president, it was interesting contrasting his approach to that of the Australian Prime Minister. While Australia's approach was to be fearful about the refugees, Obama was asking other countries to open their doors to refugees and not close them and try to return them, as has been happening here. So that is it. It's only a starter, and hopefully you can be able to discuss more on the forum. It's a big program, refugees, and big issues that are involved. I'm very passionate about this, and I've worked a lot on this, published a few papers on this. So if you have any questions, please forward them to me. Thank you very much. Bye.